What the world needs now is love, sweet love. That's the only thing there's just not enough of. Not just for some, but for everyone. These words written by Burt Bacharach, made famous by Dionne Warwick, was a famous song at one time. But there's another song that Tina Turner sang called What's Love Got to Do With It? Well, today you're probably asking, what's love got to do with liberty? But you will soon find out. Welcome to the Liberty Show with Kevin Fortune. Hey, I'm Kevin Fortune, the King of Liberty. And today on Valentine's Day, the day of love, we want to talk about love and liberty. And also it's my birthday, so I'm celebrating. Yay. I'm 39 again and again and again. But anyway, guys, we're going to talk about love and liberty tonight. We have a very special guest, a good friend of mine, a great person of love, and a person of liberty, Mr. Jeff Conner. Welcome, Jeff, to the Liberty Show.
Thank you for having me, Kevin.
And so, guys, that's Jeff Conner, Conner, if you want to look him up. And Jeff is the founder and host of a wonderful podcast called #LITA. That's #LITA. So, Jeff, to get started, tell us a little bit about Jeff Conner.
Oh, a little bit of, I think you asked me when you came on my show, Kevin, how much time do we have? So I'll throw that back at you. It's a long story, but I'll give you the Cliff Notes version. How's that? Probably the best way to describe who I am would be to just talk about what led you and I to get together. And it's been a little bit of a long road for me coming up, checking all the boxes as I was growing up in this world, and thought work hard, go get a job, and life will be great. And I got to tell you, life was anything but great. I always felt like I was missing out on something. I didn't know what. And then I decided that maybe it was because of how I worked and where I worked, and thought, well, maybe going into business for myself would be a great idea. And so I did that and decided to get into the food service business and bought out my dad's catering company and did my level best to drive that thing into the ground. It took me not too long to sit back and say, holy crap, I'm about to go bankrupt and lose everything. My wife's going to leave me. And, I just had all these visions of doom and gloom because sales weren't what I had anticipated them to be. I bit off more than I could chew moving into a great big 22,000 square foot event center. And long story short, that move though led me to hiring a business coach. And it was that move of hiring a business coach that opened my eyes up to a whole different world out there than what I had ever known. I think one of the biggest things I learned early on was just how much my limiting beliefs were holding me back. And what's been fun is that was 7 years ago, almost 8 years ago in April, that we moved into this event center. It was August of that year that I had those visions of losing everything when we weren't going to be able to pay the rent. And I had all those limiting beliefs, and I'm still finding out today and discovering what beliefs I have that are limiting, because some of them I'm not even conscious of at this point. But it's opened up this great world of personal growth and development. And I've been enjoying every minute of it, although it's been scary and kind of freakish at times too, going through all of this. But I really realized in what led me to almost bringing my business down was that my mind, the way that I thought, the things that I thought about, the way I thought, all of the above were just really getting in the way and causing me a lot of heartache and pain. And so I started searching for ways to resolve that heartache and pain and start thinking differently, and like I said, coaching, every self-help book I could get my hands on. I started devouring. I'm a huge reader. So I had a goal of reading one book a week, but I just could not. I like reading and I enjoy taking my time with a book. So one book a week could get kind of tough sometimes. So I just read as much as I can. And every morning you'll find me doing that. But I've started picking up a lot of stuff through these books and started learning. I've started going to, self-help seminars. I became a Tony Robbins fan and went to some of his business mastery courses, and just started really learning a different way to operate within the world and within my business. I ended up realizing that while I love owning a business, I'm not a person who enjoys running a business. And once I finally figured that out for myself, I decided that it was time to fire me and find somebody who could do a much better job. So it was January of 2019 where I stepped down and brought in a new CEO. Her name is Allison, and she's been doing a great job. I handed her a pretty big task to fix everything that I messed up, but her and the team are doing a great job. And then that's freed me up to pursue some other passions like coaching, life coaching, business coaching. You mentioned my podcast, and I'm sure we're going to get into why, what LITA stands for. For some of you folks, it's love is the answer is what it stands for. And there's a story about what started that, but I'm sure we'll get to that at some point down the road in this conversation. That's pretty much what led me here was that, and then a significant incident in our lives, my wife and our family's life, that led me to doing that podcast.
Well, that sounds good. Sounds a very familiar story. A lot of us don't have these perfect lives or perfect paths, perfect journeys, even though sometimes we want to pretend we do. But that's really great for our listeners to know. On your liberty journey, it's not always this perfect life, this perfect world. So, let's talk about your podcast. I had the honor of being on that hashtag LITA, Love is the Answer. And on this Love and Liberty show, let's talk about what is LITA and why did you start it and how did you get it started?
So LITA, the hashtag LITA show stands for, like I said, love is the answer. The feeling here, I'm not talking about a romantic love. I think there's many, in Latin or Hebrew, or one of these, older languages, there were so many different words for love. And agape is the one that I talk about most. As we're taping this right after Martin Luther King Day, Kevin, I've got one of his quotes, and it's really one that sticks with me. I'll just read it real quick if that's okay. And it really talks about the kind of love that I'm trying to promote through the podcast. His quote is, "Agape is disinterested love. Agape does not begin by discriminating between worthy and unworthy people or any qualities people possess. It begins by loving others for their sakes. Therefore, agape makes no distinction between friend and enemy. It is directed toward both." It's a very powerful description of this love that, I think, you and I have talked religiously and spiritually, and I think Jesus, even in the Bible, we may not have touched on this, but he talks about, it's easy to love the people that you're supposed to love, right? Your friends and your neighbors and your family. It's really hard though to love someone who maybe has hurt you or wronged you in some way. And that's what I think Martin Luther King was really addressing, is that type of a love that can be present even when things aren't going your way.
Or people you don't agree with. And that's what we're going to get to later on. You have the liberty to say, do whatever you want to. Now you're accountable for your liberty, also your actions. But that's what we're seeing right now. It's funny that when we talked months ago about recording this, we didn't know the events that would be happening historically in our nation. Said now this is just a perfect scenario. Everyone's talking about healing the nation, reconciliation. But really, if you've got that love as your foundation of liberty, it just really overrides all of those differences. But go ahead, continue. So hashtag LITA, love is the answer. How did it get started and why?
Yeah, so it got started. I alluded to it. A significant event in my life and the life of my family and all of those around us was the untimely death of our youngest son, Waylon, who was 17 years old. November 12th of 2019, Waylon passed away. We don't know whether it was a death by suicide or if he was playing what they call the choking challenge. Waylon was going through some significant mental health challenges at the time, had been hospitalized for about a month prior to that, and was really just struggling. He would talk about, the darkness in him and things like that. We don't know exactly, everything that was going on in Waylon's life, but one of the things when I had to give his eulogy, and we did this at our event center because we knew we'd have about 400 or 500 people in the audience, coming to his memorial gathering. And I wanted to provide a message of hope and a message that gave an answer to all of this. And what I really settled on in this was that love provides both of those. Love gives the answer, hence love is the answer. And love provides us with a hope. And I just thought about Waylon and other people, frankly, all of us. I remember telling those in attendance that day to look at everybody around you, look left, look right. I will guarantee you that every single person whose eyes you look into is going through something. They're bearing some burden that you know nothing about. And we just need to assume that people are struggling with stuff when we look at them. And instead of when somebody behaves in a way we don't understand, when they're acting out, when, it becomes, Waylon was the poster child for this. He made things difficult for especially his mom and I around him. Adults and people who were in, positions of authority really struggled with Waylon because he misbehaved. And he was misbehaving because of what was going on inside of his brain. And sometimes we didn't know how to tolerate that and how to deal with that. And you can imagine, for me, I was a military guy raised by a military father. So I had that kind of disciplinarian type of a mindset. And it struck me, I wonder if things would have been different if I would have just given that kid more hugs, if I would have just always went the way of love versus, trying to hold him accountable or, teach him a lesson in life and things like that. If I would have just always led with my love and my care and desire to see the best for him, how might have that changed the outcome for Waylon? So that's what started the movement. I didn't launch the podcast right away. I knew fairly soon that I was on to something with that, but I sat with it and didn't do anything with it, except for I went on and just kind of set up the name, set up the podcast on Anchor, the Anchor website that hosts those things, and just worked at getting it kind of the backbone of it set up, if you will, but didn't do any type of episode or recording at all, and was just kind of waiting for some more inspiration. And that's when George Floyd happened last May, I think it was 27th, right, of last year, 2020. It was then that I realized that I think this is where I want to come out and start talking about love is the answer. I felt like what I was seeing on the streets of Minneapolis was a great example of if we could just start showing up and caring about our fellow human beings instead of being right all the time or feeling like our opinion is the one that matters, maybe we could start turning a dial on this stuff.
Well, I want to let our audience know you do live in the greater Minneapolis-St. Paul area, correct?
Yep, I'm just about 45 minutes north of Minneapolis.
Okay. So this is firsthand to you. Well, that's a great point. So when you say love is the answer to what? And I think that's going to lead us into what we want to talk about today, because, you do have liberty, but where is the love? The foundation to me of all liberty is love. You do have freedom and other people should have freedom, but it takes love to produce that freedom. If you have freedom with no love, it's really not freedom. So go ahead. So love is the answer to what, Mr. Connor?
I don't want to sound glib, but I think love is the answer to just about everything. Every human problem that we have. I mean, I think when we look at the shelves, you go into any bookstore, look at Amazon, at the number of titles for personal development, look at the number of people, and this is a good thing. This idea of love is the answer really came out of mental health because of everything that I had gone through, with just my business, and then watching my son go through what he went through, and then all of us going through what we went through after that. It just, it really hit home that love is the answer. And really, I became very well versed in the Bible and reading that as part of my, journey through personal growth. It was a spiritual journey as well. And at the time, I can remember thinking about Ecclesiastes and man's purpose on this earth, and at the very end of Ecclesiastes, King Solomon would say, the man's sole duty is to fear and obey the Lord. And then I would fast forward to the times of Jesus, and he sat there and he said, the two greatest commandments, love God with all your heart, mind, and soul, and love your neighbor. And this is the important part of that. Love your neighbor as you love yourself. Now, I don't care where you stand, in terms of your religious and spiritual beliefs. And if you look at many of the great religious traditions, love is a very key component in all of that. But I think what gets missed sometime in those two commandments from Christianity is that love your neighbor as you love yourself. And I think when we look at the root cause of many of the problems in our world today, a lot of it can start, and probably does start, with just a lack of self-worth and self-esteem on an individual's part. And so how do people get self-worth and self-esteem when they don't have it? Well, in a lot of cruddy ways, right? We look for significance. Sometimes, you think of someone in gangs, right? They find significance, they find love and connection in that gang life. They find some significance. If you're a guy in a gang and you point a gun in somebody's face, you're going to become really significant really quick to the person who you pointed that gun at. And so, and that does, people that love and care about who they are, I don't think that they do those types of behaviors if they have a love for themselves. And I just, Tony Robbins, as I said, I'm a big fan of his. He said something that really stuck with me too. You can't give away what you don't have. And when I think about love, if you don't have that self-love and a deep love for who you are and your contribution that you can uniquely make in this world, I think it's really hard to truly have love for someone else. And so if we get back to that root, people would just really focus on seeing their worth and falling in love with themselves. I think a lot of our problems could be solved just by that love alone.
That's interesting. I want to back up a minute, and something you were talking about, love, how you look at yourself and loving others. Well, and that relates to our liberty. How can you want liberty and freedom for yourself, but you don't want it for others? I talked about on my last podcast how a friend stopped by the other day, and he was talking about what was going on in the nation. It was right after the riots there at the Capitol. And he was talking about he didn't want his kids to grow up in a nation to be slaves and to be oppressed by the government, to be mistreated. And I was like, well, what about other people of color or gays and lesbians or the poor or whatever, women that are mistreated or that suffer oppression? And he had to stop and think, we want liberty and freedom for ourselves, but we don't care about it for other people. And that's kind of a problem. So let me ask you the question. When we say love is the answer, what are we talking about? What is love? What are we talking about love? What do we mean by love?
For me, and you go back to that agape, when I think about love, I think about it as wanting the best for someone else, and not the best as I define it. That's, parents would probably be a great example of that. I want the best for my daughter, and if she's not doing what I think she should be doing, then I need to do whatever I can to basically cram that on her, force her to do something that I think is best for her. We know that doesn't work. As parents, we know that doesn't work. We know that when we just look at the polarization within our country, left versus right.
Can you tell the government that doesn't work?
Yeah. I could, but I think it would probably fall on deaf ears at this point. Right. But yeah, that's, to me, it's wanting the best for other people, recognizing, the Dalai Lama talks, he's got, I won't quote it just right, but paraphrasing, there's almost 8 billion people, maybe over 8 billion at this point, people on this planet, and everybody just wants to be happy. Now, a lot of people go about finding their happiness in some really, really cruddy ways, right? I gave you the example a few minutes ago of someone who joins a gang. They're doing that because it's in their self-interest. It's to help make them happy. And you can see the flaw in that, and we can see the flaw in that in all sorts of ways as we take what makes us happy and use it to infringe upon somebody else's liberty. In the end, it's really not going to make us happy. And we see that all the time. Zig Ziglar, another self-help guru that I love, he always talked about one of the greatest tragedies or chief causes of unhappiness is trading what you want most for what you want right now. And so we want to be thin and healthy, but yet and that's what we want most. But when we get asked if we want ice cream, that's what we want right now. So we eat the ice cream, and I think all of that just it all overlaps would be the best way for me to say it.
So let's talk a little more about some liberty and love and some specific examples and situations in our nation now. I want to just say the definition of having liberty is freedom, is defending freedom. Libertarianism is to be liberated. So once again, let's talk about, liberation for all. Like in that song, we don't just want love for some, we want love for everyone. And that is something that I'm seeing people now protest, write posts on social media about liberty and freedom, but they just want it for certain ones, for certain races or certain communities, certain groups. And that is just really perplexing to me. The definition of liberty, you can do pretty much anything you want under the name of liberty, until it harms someone else. That is not liberty when you infringe upon other people's lives or actually produce harms. We always say, don't harm anyone and don't take their stuff. So that is not liberty when you go in and harm a person, steal from them, disrespect them. That's not liberty. And that's something that we have to understand. So you alluded back a minute ago to the George Floyd thing, being there in the Minneapolis area. What do you think of that? People have, even the police sometimes, not just the police, but we have liberty in our jobs. We have liberty in our careers to do certain things. But when that liberty affects someone, especially to the point of taking their life, what do you think of that?
I think that's a great question. And as you were talking about, our liberty, we can do anything we want up until we really negatively impact somebody else. It reminded me of Booker T. Washington. And again, I won't get the quote exactly right, but he basically said, you can't hold a person down in the gutter without staying there with him. So, if we take that to what's going on with somebody getting in the way of someone else's liberty, if you're taking someone else's liberty, as long as you are taking their liberty, you're never really free. One thing I want to make sure, and I talk about my struggles. There are things that I think about and contemplate. I don't have the answers. And I would tell you that if you ever come across somebody who proclaims to have all the answers, you probably want to run away as fast as you can. I was just talking to a Buddhist friend of mine who said that there's a saying in Buddhism that you ever meet someone on the street who claims they're the Buddhist, kill them. Because someone who is truly the Buddhist would never self-proclaim to be the Buddhist, if that makes sense.
Yes.
And I think it bears out, when we look at, I have another really good friend of mine who is working on creating some new money dynamics, but he says this all the time. Individually, we each have a piece of the answer, and together we have a bigger piece of the answer. For me, that is almost a starting point to recognize that there isn't a single human being on this planet, never has been. I won't say never will be, but never has been a human being on this planet who knows everything, who has all of the answers for us, and can lay them out for us. So when we hear people who think that they've got it all figured out, we have to remember they've only got it figured out based on their limited view of the universe, of the world that we live in. And so what works for somebody may not work for you. If we spent more time just trying to understand, not agreeing, not condoning even, but just trying to understand our fellow human beings, the person sitting across from us, the person on the other side of the aisle, if we're left and they're right, what if we just spend some time understanding them versus condemning them?
Well, that is a really great point. And that's what I was alluding to, that you don't have to agree with people. You don't have to participate in what they do, but respecting their differences, respecting their beliefs, even respecting their actions. We all should be held accountable for actions. But, everyone is not wrong just because they don't agree with you. And that's something, people have the liberty, I always say, to be wrong. People have the liberty to make mistakes. They have the liberty to vote for whom they want to, even if it's different than you. They have the liberty to support politicians or laws or legislation that might not be what you think is correct, but, allow them to have that liberty. in love. Now we can totally disagree. We can argue, and I love the debate. Ask Jared, our producer here. I even like to argue a little bit. But when it comes to disrespecting people, when it comes to harming people, that is not liberty. And that's going to bring me to the next thing. You know, I was really personally disturbed. I was excited and disturbed at the riots, the chaos, the events, let's call it that, at the Capitol, January the 6th. My motto is to put liberty into action. So I was so just excited, exuberant that people went to the Capitol and they were standing up for their rights, what they believed. And even if I thought some of the stuff they were fighting for was not right, but at least they were standing up for it. But when you begin to go in the Capitol and destroy property, when you begin to kill and murder people and injure people, when you begin to call people names and wave Confederate flags and white supremacy and neo-Nazi things and disrespect the Jewish citizens, it takes something away from liberty. So let's talk about that for a minute. How could love as the answer have changed some of the events that happened that day if we were put the love into action?
From my point of view, from the way that I am working to live my life, I think it goes back to that. It goes back to understanding. As you were talking, I took a few notes, Kevin, about liberty, and we talked about voting and making our opinions known. I recently read a book, speaking of liberty. A good friend of ours told me to read it, How I Found Freedom in an Unfree World by Harry Browne. I don't know much about Harry Browne. You probably know a lot more than I do, but I think he had quite a significant position within the Libertarian Party. Am I correct in that?
Yes.
Yeah. So, but he talked about how, take something like voting. We hear things in this country like it's your duty to vote. Well, who said that? Who gets to decide that for me, that it's my duty to vote? Because I was born someplace. I had no control of where I was born and the circumstances that I was born into. I get that a lot of people find that as a great source of pride, right? And have that civic mindset and civic duty, but that was implanted in them. They didn't come out of the womb with that civic mindset. That was implanted within them through socialization, right? And in a free world, I don't have to vote. Nobody's making me vote. And does it make me bad if I don't vote? Well, I guess that's up to me to decide and not you. You can have your opinion on it, but the truth of the matter is that if I don't vote, what's it to you? And that's kind of where I look at like liberty and love is if we would just step back for a moment and recognize that if we were the person we think we are, who has all the answers and knows the way everything should be, then we would become instant hits. We'd be mega millionaires, billionaires, trillionaires. We'd change the world, but we're not. We don't have the whole answer. I look at this, debate left versus right that's going on in American politics today. And right now, I think for every person who goes too far over to the right, there's somebody else who has to go just as far over to the left to keep it balanced. If we all of a sudden were to just start agreeing on everything when it comes to how this country should be run, we would probably implode, because we would do something that throws us so far out of balance that we would just tip over. And so I think that balance is a big key in this. And I think that's what love does. When you start seeking to understand, why does that person who is a racist, where did that come from? What makes them tick and what makes them think that way? What makes, and vice versa, it goes both ways. If we would just sit back and start thinking about that, start trying to create some dialogue, start seeing the humanness in one another. I think that's one of the big problems with social media today is just how little human interaction there really is. I mean, it's all pixels and images, and it's easy to say whatever you want to when it's on a computer screen. I watched a great movie one time that showed it was on kind of a mental health. There was a therapist, and he decided to create this retreat, and he brought in a bunch of his patients, and his theme was really to start promoting love. in this. And he had, as part of the film, there was an African American woman and there was a white man, and this white man had some issues, some race issues, and it was born of ignorance, right? But he was struggling with interacting with this woman. When the counselor, the therapist, brought them together, and then there was a point where he had them touch one another, like their hands, and there was a huge shift in that man at that moment, because I believe it was because in that moment he recognized the humanity of the woman sitting across from him. And I think if we could just start seeing the humanity among our brothers and sisters, a whole lot would start changing in our world.
Well, and I totally agree. And that's where, I love this show when I do every year, because I'm all for freedom. I'm all for liberty. I'm all for people standing up and rising up. But you don't rise up. Let's rise up against the enemy. And we are not each other's enemy. Rise up against the government, rise up against the state, rise up against the oppressors, but don't rise up against each other. And I want to talk about that. One other side of you, Jeff, is that you do a lot of community service work. You do a lot of, you work with nonprofits, and you're actually working on your own foundation, I think, currently. So let's talk about that. A lot of times people want liberty, and part of liberty is, I believe in free markets. I believe in laissez-faire capitalism. I'm not a big supporter of like welfare. I'm not against it. If people need help, help them. But let's help people to feed themselves, help people to take care of themselves. But the love inside of you, how can the love inside of you not want a person to have a meal, or not want to see a person make it in life? And so let's talk about that a little bit, about the love inside of us that will also help people overcome some of their situations. Can you expound on that a little?
Yeah. It's interesting. I was just thinking about this and talking to some folks here recently about it. I asked a question one time to some sales reps when I was back in my catering company days, is self-help selfish? And a lot of people would raise their hand and say, yes, self-help is selfish, because it's a focus on the self. And then we hear things from like the Dalai Lama, all of the major religious teachings have a lot to do with getting outside of yourself and helping other people as the route to feeling better. If you put somebody else's happiness and get out of your own head, that will significantly impact the way you feel. And I believe that, but I think there are two different concepts there. I think this idea of self-improvement isn't, being selfish isn't true, because again, you can't give what you don't have. So if you don't love yourself, it's hard to give somebody else love. If you want to be able to give somebody $1 million through philanthropic giving, guess what? You got to have $1 million in order to do that. So self-help is critical, but we got to get out of our own minds why we're doing it. We're not doing it because it's all about us. We weren't put on this earth, I don't believe, to be self-serving. Yes, we're all going to operate out of our own self-interest. Nobody donates to an organization or volunteers for an organization. I truly don't believe in any unselfish acts. We are always looking at our own self-interest. I give and I volunteer because of the way it makes me feel. And it makes me feel that way often because in the moments when I'm in volunteering, so, you talked about my nonprofit work, Kevin. I work as a development officer, raising money, increasing volunteerism, and helping to promote Stepping Stone Emergency Housing, which is a homeless shelter up here in Anoka, Minnesota. And we're a resident-based shelter, so we're not an overnight shelter. We actually have residents who come stay with us for, 90, 180, sometimes even longer than that, as they work and they strive toward their own self-sufficiency, and we're helping them along the way. But when I would go in early on, before I became an officer there, I was volunteering, and I'd go into the kitchen and just serve meals. I did a little mentoring with some of the residents. And I'll tell you what, I was going in every Tuesday at noon for a long time, for probably a better part of a year. And it got to be that hour every Tuesday, I looked forward to more than any other hour of the week. And that 1 hour of the week filled my gas tanks full of purpose so much that it helped me get through the rest of the week. And it's getting out of our own way and getting more concerned about other people. We hear it all the time. You look at relationships. If you're in a bad relationship, a lot of times we look at what are the faults of the other person and how can they change to make me happier and make our relationship better. I'm here to tell you right now, forget that. That is completely backwards thinking. You can only change you. You only have control of you. And as your world inside begins to change, the world outside of you changes without anything changing. It's just your perspective on things. And so if we could see people's opinions as being honestly developed, why does somebody think far right and somebody think far left? Why do two people living in the same house as brother and sister end up being diametrically philosophically opposed to one another? And it's because of their life experiences. Their individualized, unique life experiences creates a lens and a filter through which they view the world. And if you're just looking at what they say and do without trying to understand it, you're missing out on a whole world of what led them to come to those beliefs. And those beliefs are formed through traumatic events in their life, just their life experiences when they chose this over that. There's a million things, the TV shows that we watch. We wonder, I talk about all the time, up in rural kind of Minnesota, I feel like I lived in Nashville for a long time growing up back in the 80s, back when they were really, well, actually late 70s, early 80s. You probably remember busing, desegregation was huge in the South, especially back then. And I was bused across town. There was a school 3 blocks away from me, but I had to drive on a bus, 15 miles across town to go to a school in a different neighborhood, all in an effort to desegregate us kids. And I think it was a wonderful thing that we did, and that we were a part of, because I don't recall any racial problems in my school. All of our racial problems came from when we went home and listened to our stupid parents talk about stuff. But when I went to school, it was either, do you have cool toys and do we like the same stuff? Cool, let's play around. We didn't care about skin color. It was the parents who cared about that. But then when I moved up here to Minnesota and I lived in a rural area, I heard more racially insensitive and just racist, bigoted comments up here from people who'd never been around people of color, which was just, it boggled my mind. And what I finally discerned over all these years is, part of it is where do they get that? Where do they get their knowledge of people of color? If you're a white guy living in an all white area up in northern Minnesota, and you may live your entire life and never have even been around a person of color. So where does that opinion of a person of color come from? It comes from other people, and it comes from the media.
Great point. And that's what you hit on so many great points. That is what I'm saying, that, let's have our liberty, have your freedom, but let's also add love into that, so that when you look through your eyes of liberty, you're looking through the eyes of love. You can see liberty, you can have liberty, but have love and liberty would just really enhance your vision, your view of people, of situations. And I'm glad you mentioned the race thing. As we close out today, our country still has a lot of race issues, not only race issues, but economic issues, the poor and the rich. And like you said, the people in the suburbs and the people in the city, different ethnicities, different cultures, different denominations of religions, so much segregation. So how can we use our love, even though people have the liberty to serve different gods and to have different sexual orientations, different, economic levels. But how can we use the love is the answer to bring people together so that we can be one nation under God, as we often say?
Again, I think it goes back to this notion of wanting the best for the other person. When I was deep into my Christian discovering period, because I've looked into many of the major religions. I got really turned off by friends up here talking about Islam and Muhammad and the Quran and how bad it was and how evil it was. So I read it. I started reading it, and I was like, this isn't what they're describing. There's more violence. When we look at our own Christian Bible, we can see, there's things in there about dashing babies against rocks. That's it's part of the story, I guess, of those religions. And what I got tired of was that people would talk about things that they didn't know anything about. And so I would say, as a Christian, even somebody who I struggled with, who made it hard, I would say to I hope to see you in heaven one day. I hope to see you in heaven one day. For me, that was the best way to say, I want the very best for you. Whether you believed it as I believed or not, I felt like at that time, that I understood some truth. I don't know, as things evolve, that changes, but that was the best way that I could see to really, show and demonstrate that I cared about the other person. And I think it's a recognition. There's a guy who is, from long ago, I stumbled across a book. His name's Alan Watts, and he wrote a book called The Taboo Against Knowing Who You Really Are. And there's a section in there about the game of black versus white. Now, I'm not talking about racial. I'm talking about opposites. It's kind of the game of right versus left. Mm-hmm. And what he talks about is, in a non-dual world, is how everything is kind of necessary. White relies on black. Right relies on left. Up relies on down. Without one, you don't have the other. And so everything's about perspective and positioning. And the reality is that in our current system, the way we are, as I alluded to earlier, right needs left and left needs right. And if we could start waking up to that thought that everything is happening and we're growing and evolving as a human species because of the very fact that we're living human lives and very imperfect human lives. And if we could just start forgiving people, their humanness. I do that all the time. If I do some boneheaded move, make some silly mistake, or say something I didn't mean to say, I instantly will, once I catch it, I'll say, well, there you go, Jeff. Forgive yourself for being human again. And that's literally what I do. And we're all human. We're all doing the best we can. We're all trying to find our own happiness. Some unfortunately have come to believe and been conditioned to believe that their happiness is dependent upon somebody else not being happy. To me, I feel like they're just confused.
Or I agree, or their happiness is more important than other people's happiness. So yes, as we're closing out, our announcer, Jared, he's a big philosophical person and religious type person. But Jared, do you have any comments on this subject as we close out today?
Yeah, I think it's. I've really loved everything Jeff has had to say here. It's been fascinating listening along, hearing Alan Watts, this idea of agape, and all these different traditions that have these incredible resources in them for being able to really actualize this idea of love and take it from something that can feel really abstract and ambiguous into something a bit more concrete and embodied. So I was especially liking what Jeff was saying about being able to not just rely on these kind of first impressions we have, or these misconceptions that we may be fed through society, through media, through all these things about other people. Because when you scrape that all back, you're just left with people who are people as complicated and messy and hopeful as we all are. And if we can get back to that more natural state of being with each other, well, maybe it's not so hard to be compassionate, to be open-minded and kind with people. We have all these kind of apparatuses going on nowadays that try and make us feel certain ways about certain kinds of people, and it's easy to fall into that, and that can be a huge roadblock to being loving and allowing the liberty for other people. But I mean, when it comes down to it, when you see people face to face, eye to eye, and realize there's not all this extra garbage we necessarily need to take into account to be present with each other, I think that opens whole new doors for being able to just be kind and reasonable with one another.
Great, great perspective. And I just want to say that that's what this whole show is about. Have your liberty, have your beliefs, have your rights, but be respectful, be open-minded for other people's liberty. And that all starts with love. Just what kind of nation would we have if, especially our government, when they made laws and judicial decisions, it was based also from the view of love, of loving human beings. People that are different, people think different, people have political differences. But what if we made all of our decisions, our protocols, our regulations, and all of this if it started with the concept of love? So once again, you're on the Liberty Show with Kevin Fortune. Our special guest was Mr. Jeff Connor from the podcast #LITA, LITA. So Jeff, what is the final word? As you speak to the nation, what would you like to say in closing?
I would say, along these lines, question all of your beliefs, all of your assumptions. You know, why in some segments of our society on this earth do some people celebrate and laugh and feel nothing but extreme joy upon the passing of a loved one? And why do some cultures and some folks go through severe mourning and intense grief? And I would suggest that the difference between those two is all in the way they've been conditioned inside of their own minds. It's a belief system. And so when you see things not working, challenge beliefs and start rooting them out and finding where there might be some different ways of looking at something to get a different answer.
So in closing, Jeff, thank you for being on the Liberty Show. Tell our listeners, how can they find you, where they can find you, and get in touch with you?
Yeah. So the #LITA podcast is the website for that is www.LITA, LITA for life spelled out. So FORLIFE.com, LITAforlife.com. You can go there. You can contact me through that. There's contact pages and all the access to every show that we've done so far is on there. And that's the best way to get in touch with me.
Well, thank you so kindly. Thank you guys for listening. You can reach us, The Liberty Show with Kevin Fortune on YouTube, Facebook, Instagram. We're on Anchor, Apple iTunes, all of the social medias and all of the podcasting platforms. Or you can go to our website, www.thelibertyshow.us. Thank you so much. Liberty and love to everyone.